Good morning, dear students. We are a little late in starting today. So, the class that I'm going to take is something that was taken last class, where I think only 7 students were present. So, I thought it's better for everybody that I repeat this class. Okay, so the topic today is pancreatic cancer. Now, if you look at how common this cancer is, number one, pancreatic cancers are more common in developing countries. In the developed countries. And when you look at the developing countries, the incidence in the developing countries is much less. In the developed countries like US and other Western countries, it is also one of the leading causes of death. So worldwide, when you look at the figures, pancreatic cancers constitute about 2 to 3% of all cancer deaths. Of all the cancer deaths worldwide, pancreatic cancers constitute about 2 to 3%. That is the incidence worldwide. In India, in 1 lakh patients, maybe you have about 1 to 2 persons suffering, that's in the men, and in the women it is much less. So the take-home message from here is it's a disease which is common in the Western countries, not so common in Indian countries. Worldwide, about 2 to 3% of all cancer deaths are because of pancreatic malignancy. Now, if you look at the risk factors, what all cause this particular problem and in what age group and whatever you see. So if you look at the demographics, clearly, if you look at the age, most of the cancer is there in those age groups, which is 65 to 75 years. That means it's a disease of the old age. But in India, at least, I can tell you, we see it much before the 60 to 75 years. 65 to 75 years is the Western figures. Between male and female, we find that males are more susceptible to it. In the West, especially the black ethnicity or the Negro or the black community, the incidence is more of that. Among the environmental factors, we have found that cigarette smoking is very strongly associated with this particular cancer. That means cigarette smoking in some way or the other may actually be causing pancreatic malignancy. A classical example is Steve Jobs, who died. He died of pancreatic malignancy and also he was a heavy cigarette smoker. Now, there are certain medical conditions in which we find that the incidence of pancreatic cancer is high. Number one is diabetes mellitus. That means a long-standing diabetes mellitus itself can lead to development of pancreatic malignancy. Then there is another entity called hereditary pancreatitis. It has a very high chance or risk of contracting cancer. When you compare with the general population, it is about 50 times or 70 times more than the general population. That is hereditary pancreatitis. Then you also have in a family, if 2 or more first degree relatives have suffered from pancreatic cancer, in patients coming from these families, we find the incidence of cancer is much, much higher compared to the general population. Chronic pancreatitis is another setting where the risk is about 5 to 15 times more. You don't need to remember the risk, how much more it is, but just remember diabetes mellitus, hereditary pancreatitis, family history of pancreatic cancers, and chronic pancreatitis. These are the settings in which the incidence of malignancy is actually high. Then we go to the next category, that is basically the genetic factors. Now, among the genetic factors, by now you know what is breast cancer, BRCA. BRCA1 and BRCA2 are there. So, especially those patients who have this BRCA2 mutations in them, running in the families, in these families, the incidence of cancer is much, much higher. Then there are certain syndromes, like the Lynch syndrome, which is also known as non-hereditary polyposis coli syndrome. So, in Lynch syndrome, ataxia telangiectasia, Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. In these syndromes, we find that the incidence of pancreatic malignancy is much, much higher compared to the general population. Then among the familial diseases or cancers which run in family, there are 3 things that you need to remember. First is the familial breast and ovarian cancer syndrome. So it's a syndrome where patients will be suffering either from breast cancer or from ovarian cancer. So this familial breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, these patients also have a high incidence of pancreatic malignancy. Next comes familial atypical multiple mole melanoma syndrome. Okay, FAM3 syndrome. It is familial atypical multiple mole and melanoma syndrome. In these patients, also pancreatic malignancy is high. The third category, or for that matter, very important, is the FAP or the familial adenomatous polyposis coli syndrome. Now, in this, you basically have multiple polyps existing all over the GIT. And one specific malignancy of the pancreas which you develop here is there is a high risk of ampullary carcinoma or a dorsal carcinoma which arises within 2 centimeters of the sphincter of Oddi. So these categories are what is called as periampullary carcinoma, as we'll be discussing a little later. Now, as far as the pathology is concerned, it is important to note that more than 85% of all the cancers which arise from the pancreas are actually ductal adenocarcinoma. That is, from the duct epithelium, you have adenocarcinomas arising. That is more than 85%. Then there are certain other tumors also which arise from pancreas, maybe are less important, but they have their own unique features. The number one is the neuroendocrine tumors or the endocrine tumors of the pancreas. They arise from the islet cells of the pancreas. And the most common neuroendocrine tumor which arises from the pancreas is something called as a insulinoma. So here there is basically secretion of increased amount of insulin. So the patient repeatedly goes into hypoglycemic episodes. And as soon as he is given glucose, the patient symptoms revert back to normal. This is called Whipple's triad. I'll be talking about insulinoma a little later in my next class perhaps. But for now, among the endocrine tumors, all you need to remember is insulinoma is by far the commonest of them all. Then you have cystic adenocarcinomas. You have heard of cystic tumors of the pancreas. When I talked about pseudocysts, I did make a little mention about cystic tumors from the pancreas. The most common cystic adenocarcinoma that you get from the pancreas is the mucinous variant. You also have a serous variant, but the serous variant has a less chance of malignancy. So basically, as far as the adenocarcinoma is concerned, the cystic adenocarcinoma, the mucinous variety is more common. Pertinent for you to know is it arises mainly from the tail. Most other tumors usually are common in the head area, but cystic adenocarcinomas and cystic, especially the mucinous variety of the cystic adenocarcinoma, they usually arise from the tail. And obviously, they are cystic in nature. These are not solid tumors. Of course, within the cystic cavity that you get, there will be areas of solid tumor that you see. And characteristically, what you see here, the cystic adenocarcinomas, the CEA level, the carcinoembryonic antigen, these levels are very, very high. Then you have another entity which you need to remember at least the name, that is called as intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasm, or in short, they are known as IPMNS. These characteristically they arise from the head of the pancreas. It arises from the ductal epithelium, and more importantly, they are actually cystic in nature. They are not as large as the cystic adenocarcinomas, but yes, they are cystic, no doubt. And the IPMNS, or the intraductal papillary mucinous neoplasms, they have a very, very high association with this huge Jenner syndrome. And not every IPMN is basically malignant. As the name goes, neoplasm, they can be basically benign variant as well as malignant variant. We find that of all the IPMNs, about 1/3 of them are invasive carcinomas. Last but not the least is a very interesting entity which is called as acinar cell carcinomas. Now, the acinar cell carcinomas, you commonly find them in the salivary glands, but wherever you have acinar tissue, like what we have in the pancreas, which is basically secreting certain things like amylase, lipase, and all that, you can actually have these tumors arising in any of the glands. Okay, any of the acinar glands. So the characteristic thing about this acinar cell carcinomas is they secrete lipase. They secrete lipase. So most of these are associated with high levels of lipase, not as high as what you see in, let's say, acute pancreatitis, but nevertheless, the lipase levels tend to be high in this. And the next hormone that is secreted is something called alpha-fetoprotein. So acinar cell carcinomas, typically you have raised levels of lipase and alpha-fetoprotein. Now, the ductal adenocarcinomas, they commonly arise from the head of the pancreas. They usually are solid tumors. And what you basically find is in the center, this is the area where malignancy is. And they are called adenocarcinomas because they tend to be arranged in the form of a gland. And the central part, which you see, which appears a little white, this is the area where there's a lot of fibrosis, which is also known as desmoplastic reaction. Okay, so the pancreatic malignancy is therefore quite hard when you palpate, and that is because of the intense desmoplastic reaction that we have. And because of this lot of desmoplastic reaction that happens, these adenocarcinomas tend to infiltrate locally. And typically they spread along the nerve sheath within the pancreatic tissue and also along the lymphatics. And of course, they enter into the blood vessels, which we call as angioinvasion. So basically, spreads along the neural sheath, along the lymphatics, and into the blood vessels. And very commonly, we find that they metastasize to the liver or also to the peritoneal tissue. Okay, so these are basically what is called as peritoneal deposits. Now, if you look at how often and which area they are distributed, means the gross pathology of these tumors. As far as site is concerned, most of the tumors, they arise from the head of the pancreas. The common area is the head of the pancreas, then the body and the tail. And the most important thing that you also need to remember, apart from the fact that they are common in the head of the pancreas, they also arise in a particular area which we call as a periampullary area, which I'll be talking a little later. So periampullary carcinomas, they constitute roughly about 5% of all the tumors. So 55% in the head, 25 in the body, 15 in the tail, and 5 in the periampullary area. You need not remember all these facts and figures, but what you need to remember is the pancreas head, that is the area where it is most commonly found, and a special area that is called the periampullary region. There are about 5% of the tumors. Macroscopically, like I have already just described to you, the growth, because of the intense desmoplastic reaction that happens, is usually hard and it infiltrates into the local tissues around the pancreas. As far as the histology, again, I have already discussed. Most of them are adenocarcinomas. That means about 85 to 90% of all the tumors which arise from the pancreas tend to be ductal adenocarcinomas. And of course, you have others like the cystic neoplasms, endocrine, acinar cell carcinomas, which I have discussed with you. Those are the other varieties. Spread is usually spreads along the lymphatics to the peritoneum and the renal lymph nodes, and ultimately through the blood, it ultimately ends up going to the liver and to the lungs. Remember, the drainage is through the portal system, so most of the metastasis that goes, the visceral metastasis that happens, usually will first go to the liver, and from the liver, it will metastasize through the blood to other areas like the lung or the bones or other tissues. Now, this periampullary carcinoma, which I talked about, it's a very specific area. If you look at this is basically the C loop of the duodenum. This is the pancreas, the tail, the body, the neck region, and this is the head. And this part which is going behind us called the uncinate process. And this is the main pancreatic duct coming here, and this is the CBD that is coming. They're joining together and forming the ampulla vata, and it's opening out to this particular ostia here. Okay. So from the ostia, if you take a radius of 2 centimeters, so 2 centimeters around the area where the ampulla vata is located, in that area, we have basically a lot of other tissues, like you have the duodenal mucosa coming, then you have the ampullary mucosa, then you have the lower end of the CBD, that mucosa, and you also have the main pancreatic duct coming. So these various or the 4 types of tissues that I have mentioned, cancers can arise from this area, and these are basically what is known as the periampullary carcinoma. So from the duodenum, you get basically the classical adenocarcinomas, and the good thing about this adenocarcinomas is the prognosis of this adenocarcinoma is much better than the adenocarcinoma that arises from the main pancreatic duct. That means periampullary carcinomas in general have a better prognosis compared to the classical carcinoma head of pancreas epithelium. From the distal CBD, you can basically, what you get is not exactly adenocarcinomas. You can get adenocarcinomas, but what is typical is you get what is called as cholangiocarcinomas. And from the ampulla area, that is the area that is formed after the joining of the lower end of CBD and the main pancreatic duct, you get adenocarcinomas. The prognosis of this adenocarcinomas is much better compared to the adenocarcinomas that arise from the pancreatic ductal tissue. And last but not the least, of course, is from the pancreatic duct, which is there within 2 centimeters of the ampulla, you get what is called as the adenocarcinoma arising from the pancreatic duct. So that is as far as periampullary carcinoma is concerned. So this is very important. If you are asked what is periampullary region is that region which is within 2 centimeters of the sphincter of Oddi, and that constitutes duodenal mucosa. Then you have basically the lower end of CBD. Then you have the terminal part of the main pancreatic duct, and of course the common channel, and that is what we call as the ampulla pattern. So these are the 4 structures which constitute periampullary carcinoma. The important thing about periampullary carcinoma is the prognosis of periampullary carcinomas, especially because of cholangiocarcinoma arising from the lower part of CBD and the adenocarcinoma that arises from the duodenum. The prognosis is relatively better as compared to adenocarcinomas which arise from the carcinoma head of the pancreas. Now, as far as presenting symptoms are concerned, the presenting symptoms will depend on where the location of the tumor is. Again, if you see, the pancreas is quite a large or a long elongated structure. So, if you have carcinomas arising in this area, the periampullary region or the head region, they can actually cause a lot of problems because they can obstruct the lower end of CBD, they can obstruct the duodenum. Therefore, by and large, if you see periampullary carcinoma and head area, they tend to present little early, whereas the body and the tail area, the presentation features which come are little late. So, carcinoma head of pancreas or carcinomas which arise from the head area, they usually are classically described as something called as painless and progressive jaundice. So, carcinoma head of pancreas have obstructive jaundice which is painless and progressive. When we say painless and progressive, it does not mean that there is no pain whatsoever. But usually pain will come in these malignancies a little late when they infiltrate into the neural tissues within the pancreas. So once pain comes on, that means probably it is a relatively advanced lesion. So the classical description is painless, progressive or unrelenting jaundice. And when we say jaundice, we are referring to the obstructive jaundice. And classically what you also have is, you have a palpable gallbladder. The gallbladder actually enlarges. And that is what is called as Courvoisier's law. So Courvoisier's law is basically in an obstructive jaundice patient, if you have a palpable gallbladder, most likely the cause is not because of stones. Because in the case of stones, what happens is the gallbladder actually undergoes fibrosis and shrinks in size. Therefore, it loses its capacity to expand when there is, back pressure of the bile. So therefore, whenever stones are there, they don't tend to enlarge. Mind you, in CBD stones also you actually have obstructive jaundice because the CBD stones will be obstructing the CBD. But in those cases, we don't find the gallbladder to be enlarged. Whereas in the case of carcinoma head of pancreas, when the lower end of the CBD is blocked, in that case, what happens is the gallbladder, which is not diseased, undergoes distension, and that is what is basically Courvoisier's law. Okay, then the next symptom which we commonly see, patient usually has some degree of nausea and vomiting because there tends to be a little early duodenal block. But by the time the patient has a duodenal block, usually the malignancy is a little advanced. And of course, the patient has the classical setting of, because of obstructive jaundice or the surgical jaundice, patient has pruritus, he passes dark urine and the clay, the stools tend to be clay colored or whitish in color. Now, when you come to the periampullary region, if you look at the description of jaundice, here it is painless and progressive jaundice. But here, the jaundice is intermittent. And the reason why the jaundice here is intermittent, we need to go back to the previous slide. Now here what happens when you have growth coming out in this region, what happens is, especially when they are in the ampullary region, what happens is it causes obstruction to that area. But this is also the passage through which food and all is coming. So many a times, periampullary carcinomas, they undergo sloughing off. So when they slough off, two things happen. The blocked CBD channel that was there, that tends to open up. And the second thing that happens is patient also has bleeding. So here you will find that the jaundice is intermittent. It is not painless and progressive jaundice, but rather the jaundice tends to be intermittent. But it is not always necessary that it will be intermittent, but sometimes in this it can also be painless and progressive. But what is typical in periamputary carcinoma is the jaundice can be intermittent, whereas in the case of carcinoma head or pancreas, it doesn't tend to be intermittent, whereas it tends to be actually progressive. Here you will find sometimes blood in stools, that is basically melena. Of course, the stools usually will be clay during the time when obstruction is there, and again, when there is relief of obstruction and the patient has intermittent jaundice, during those times the patient may have normal colored stools. So the stool colors will depend on the phase of jaundice in the patient. Now, when the tumor is there in the body, the main features you get is back pain, anorexia, weight loss, and steatorrhea. When it is there in the tail, again, it tends to be rather asymptomatic, and more often than not, they usually may have some degree of back pain. So basically, it is some amount of back pain the patient may complain, or he may have some unexplained anemia, or the patient may develop some advanced features like malignant ascites, or the patient may have again some more advanced features of malignancy in the form of metastasis, and that metastasis may be like enlarged liver, or it could be the left supraclavicular node that is enlarged. So head usually presents early, periamputary presents early. Here you have intermittent jaundice. Body and tail, usually the features are rather non-specific, especially the tail area, it is more non-specific. In the body, of course, you have backache, anorexia, weight loss, and steatorrhea. Now, when you look at the clinical features of this patient, usually patient has jaundice, and when you examine the patient, you will find that the patient is actually having obstructive jaundice. There may be accompanied weight loss, and a significant weight loss is when they have lost more than 10% of their total body weight in a period of 6 months. Patients usually have a palpable gallbladder, that is the Courvoisier's loss. That means as long as the patient is having high jaundice, it is quite likely that the patient may be having a palpable gallbladder. But sometimes the gallbladder may not be palpable because many a times these patients also may be having a gallstone. So when they have a gallstone, the gallbladder actually has undergone some degree of fibrosis. So you may find that the gallbladder may not be palpable, or it may be just about palpable. But commonly, if we consider that there is no accompanying gallstone, usually the gallbladder will be palpable. Now, there may be other signs of intra-abdominal malignancy, which we need to look, which is basically number one, palpable mass. Usually, pancreas is situated quite deep. So, if you have a palpable mass which arises from the pancreas, that is usually a sign of advanced malignancy. Then the patient also can have abdominal distension because of fluid collection, and that is what is the malignant ascites. Patient can have left supraclavicular lymph nodes which are enlarged, and when you do a upper rectal examination, you may find that the patient may be having malignant deposits in the pouch of Douglas. And usually these mean the prognosis is rather poor. So when you work up this patient, of course, because the patient is having obstructive jaundice, you will be doing the whole LFT. And once the LFT is derailed, the patient may have derangement of the synthetic function. Therefore, the prothrombin time also may be derailed. So these are the things which you necessarily need to do. And every time you are dealing with a jaundice patient, apart from doing the LFT and PT, you also need to consider the fact that this patient may be having an obstructive, may be having this jaundice because of hepatitis B or C. So doing viral markers in all jaundice patients is almost mandatory. Every malignancy usually will have some amount of, in this case, periamputary carcinoma, they can have blood loss happening. And anyway, in any chronic malignancy, you have what is called as the chronic anemia of malignancy. So you need to do the hemogram to see how much the hemoglobin is, and of course the other parameters. And sometimes one of the leading cause of obstructive jaundice also can be a benign disease like a gallstone disease. And gallstone disease sometimes will have the total count and the neutrophil count will be raised. So once you see those figures are raised, you need to basically start thinking whether you are there in the your diagnosis is right, or maybe it is something else. Any patient who has high jaundice usually can go into renal failure, so you need to look at the renal parameters. Chest X-ray PA view is almost mandatory to look for possibilities of secondary deposits in the chest, but secondary deposits in the chest usually happen quite late. And apart from chest X-ray, usually it is CT of the thorax, which is more sensitive and more informative compared to chest X-ray PA view, but it is chest X-ray PA view that is usually classically taken. ECG, most patients tend to be a little on the older side, therefore ECG is a must just to know whether the patient has any accompanying comorbid condition of the heart or not. Viral markers I've just talked about. And there are two tumor markers, the CEA and the carbohydrate antigen 19-9. Of the CEA, like I said, commonly the values tend to be very, very high in the case of cystic neoplasms of the pancreas, that is, especially the cyst adenocarcinomas, the mucinous variety. The CA19-9 is more specific for carcinoma hepatopancreas and periapitic carcinoma, that means the solid tumors. Okay, so these usually, when you do the testing, if the values like CA19-9, if the value is more than 37, or the values, where the value is more than 37, that usually would mean that probably there may be some cause, maybe malignancy due to which the CA19-9 is high. And if the values are more than 110, usually that would mean that probably there is malignancy arising from the pancreas, and that has advanced and probably has metastasized to your other areas. So once you resect the tumor, treat the tumor, usually these values which were high usually comes down. And in the follow-up period, usually you keep measuring the CEA and the carbohydrate antigen, and if the levels have started to come up, that usually means the patient is probably having some sort of a recurrence. Nothing much, but I think you just need to remember that in pancreatic cancers, compared to CEA, carbohydrate antigen 19-9 perhaps is more sensitive. Okay, the cutoff value is somewhere around 37 units per ml. That means values higher than this would mean that there is some reason why it has gone up, and one of the reasons that we need to keep in mind is pancreatic malignancy. The other conditions in which it can go up is the benign conditions of the pancreas, like even in chronic pancreatitis, the levels can go up. Then the liver and bile duct pathologies, in those cases also it goes up. But those values are usually hovering just around 37 degrees. If you have value which is way above 37, let's say around more than 120, that usually would signify that probably the patient has got some sort of advanced malignancy. Now, what are the investigations you do? Apart from the routine blood tests and all that I have just talked about, the specific investigations which will help you to establish a diagnosis, in that the number one investigation is ultrasound abdomen. I have been telling this time and time again that ultrasound abdomen is very commonly available in almost every hospital, doesn't cost much, and it is a non-invasive imaging technique. So almost always we usually employ this as the first investigation. Not that it is an investigation of choice, but it is probably the most commonly used investigative tool. Usually small tumors it may not be able to detect, but larger tumors it will be able to pick up. Okay, so that is the value of ultrasound. And in advanced malignancies, apart from detecting a large tumor in the head area, it can also show you if the CBD is enlarged. It can also tell you whether any hepatic metastasis is there or not. It can also tell you whether any fluid collection in the form of malignant ascites is there in the peritoneal cavity or not. So this kind of information you will be able to get. Okay. And apart from the fact that it can detect the tumor, it can also very clearly tell you whether it's a solid tumor or a cystic tumor. So these are the kind of information that you can get by doing ultrasound abdomen. Now, when you do a CCT, which is by far the most commonly employed investigation of choice. Okay, when we say CCT, there is a particular modality that is followed. This is contrast enhanced CT scan with pancreatic protocol. So in pancreatic protocol, what we do is we give the patient oral contrast as well as patient is given IV contrast. and we take pictures during the arterial phase and also during the portal venous phase. Okay, and this combination of doing the CCT with the arterial as well as portal venous phase, that means pictures taken during the arterial phase as well as the portal phase, we find that even small lesions can actually be picked up by CCT scan. Therefore, if you ask me which is the gold standard investigation, it is contrast enhanced CT scan with pancreatic protocol. That is the investigational choice. Now, endoscopy is not always helpful, but usually endoscopy is very critical when we are dealing with periambulatory carcinomas, because periambulatory carcinomas, more often than not, when you do a upper GI endoscopy, you can see a lesion like this. This is within the lumen. What you see is this is the area probably where the sphincter of Oda is, and that area is blocked. And you can see a mass which is protruding out from the sphincter of Oda area, that is in the ampullary area. So this is the kind of pictures that you see in endoscopy. Okay, and these are some of the other pictures. This is basically the lumen, and what you see here is some sort of a mass that is there. And here in the, again, this is the lumen, and here in the ampullary area, you can clearly make out there is a ulceroproliferative mass. Okay, this is under magnification. Probably it will be less than a centimeter in size. Okay, so these are basically classical periambulatory carcinomas that you are able to visualize when you do a GI endoscopy. And here, these are much smoother looking tumors which have not undergone any form of necrosis. Then apart from doing a CCT and the other two investigations that I just talked about, now the question is, what is the role of ERCP and MRCP? Usually, we do not do ERCP unless there is some other reason, like we want to take a biopsy or we want to take a. I'll be coming to conditions where we actually would like to do ERCP. The most commonly done investigation is what is called the MRCP. Okay, so in MRCP, you are able to see what is called as a double duct sign. You can read up what exactly is double duct. Sign double duct basically refers to the CBD and the base pancreatic duct. There is a block in this area, so you will find one area where sort of a narrowing and of course a distension part is there. Now this narrowing as well as distension part is well seen in MRI, whereas in CT scan this duct cannot be appreciated as well as it is appreciated in MRCP. Therefore, in MRCP, if you are able to see the double duct sign, that usually is an indirect evidence of malignancy in probably the head area. Now, MRCP, whatever you get, same information you will get by doing a ERCP. But the problem with ERCP is a sort of an invasive methodology. So we don't like to do ERCP because once we do ERCP, we can always be disposed to basically bleeding from the tumor, or we can introduce what we call as pancreatitis. Okay, so for this reason, ERCP is not used. But ERCP is sometimes invaluable when we want to take a brush cytology. That means we push in a brush through the scope into the region of the tumor, and from that, we just brush that area and collect that and send it for cytology. Or if you have a situation where the obstructive jaundice is very high and the patient is likely to go into further complications because of high jaundice, in this case, we may like to put a stent in the CBD just to bring down the bilirubin and normalize the patient, and then we can operate. So for that, we can put a palliative stent, and sometimes, or for that matter, nowadays, even when there is a duodenal obstruction, we can also put a stent into the duodenum. Then we also have this new modality which is called the endoscopic ultrasound. It is not always available in most institutions, including NDIGILS, we do not have it. But one thing you need to remember about EUS is it is excellent for staging the tumor and of course for taking EUS guided pancreatic biopsies. Now the advantage of when you take biopsies through this is, since you are going through the lumen and from the lumen you are going into the pancreas and taking some sort of a biopsy, the biopsy tissue does not contaminate the general peritoneal cavity, which happens when you take a ultrasound guided biopsy, transabdominal biopsy. In that case, there is a chance of tumor seedlings falling into the pancreatic into the peritoneal cavity. That does not happen when you take endoscopic ultrasound guided biopsy. So endoscopic ultrasound is excellent as far as the T and the N staging of the tumor is concerned, and also for taking biopsies from the pancreatic tissue. Now, PET-CT is used here also, and almost in all other malignancies in good centers they do a PET-CT, and PET-CT is mainly very, very invaluable when we want to know whether any distant metastasis has happened. Staging, you don't bother, this is not important for you, but just to understand the overview, in stage 1, the tumor is limited to the pancreas and there are no nodes or any metastasis. In stage 2, again, the tumor is by and large limited to the pancreas, but within the pancreas, because the lower part of the bile duct is within the pancreas, so some of the structures which are there in the close vicinity of the pancreatic tissue, like the bile duct, okay, and peripancreatic tissue or into the duodenum, it may have spread. So this is limited to the pancreas. This spreads a little beyond the pancreas into those structures which are intimately connected with the pancreas, like the lower end of the bile duct, the peripancreatic tissue, or basically the duodenum. Again, there are no nodes and no metastasis here. In stage 3, everything is same like what you have in stage 2. But you also have positive lymph nodes, and they're usually in the celiac or mesenteric. Usually they have lymph nodes, or it may have spread in the celiac or the superior mesenteric artery area. And stage 4, of course, is advanced malignancy. Just for you to have a brief overview of the staging. Like I said, staging is not really important for you. But just remember, stage 1, it is confined to the pancreas. Stage 2, it has just gone into the peripancreatic tissues, but there are no lymph nodes. In stage 3, it has gone into the peripancreatic areas, and there are also lymph nodes, or there may also be involvement of the vessels, that is the superior mesenteric artery or the celiac axis. And stage 4, where the distant mets have happened. Now, based on the various factors that we find on investigation, we may have a situation where the tumor is resectable, or on the other hand, where the tumor is not resectable, and you have in between where we call as borderline resectability. That means in a good center, probably resection can be done. So, what are the features or signs of a tumor which is resectable? A tumor which is resectable is that which is confined to the pancreas. That means the stage 1 tumors. Of course, in stage 1 tumor, there is absence of any extra pancreatic disease. The fat planes between the tumor and the superior mesenteric artery and veins obviously are normal. The tumor, if it encases the superior mesenteric artery, does not encase more than half circumference, that is 180 degrees of the superior mesenteric artery. The superior mesenteric and the portal vein confluence, which is there in the neck region, that area is usually patent, and there is no extension into the celiac axis or the superior mesenteric artery area. So these are the tumors which are considered as resectable. Now, tumors which are considered borderline resectable are those which have, the superior mesenteric and the portal vein confluence area. There is some degree of occlusion, but it is usually a very short area of involvement, so to say. So that area basically can be cut off and we can put a graft, and the rest of the surgery can be done. And also, as far as superior mesenteric artery is concerned, if you have a very short segment involvement less than 1 centimeter, in that case, it is kind of a borderline resectable. That means if you have a good surgeon doing it, probably he may be able to with all the facilities available. And absolute contraindications are those patients where you have extra pancreatic disease. Usually when we talk about extra pancreatic disease, I'm talking about the distant metastasis like spread which has happened to the liver or to the lungs or to the left supracardiac lymph node or malignant ascites that is mentioned here. So in these cases, once there is distant metastasis, we do not do it. Now, as far as encasement of the celiac axis or the superior mesenteric artery is concerned, any involvement which is more than 180 degrees circumference, that is considered as non-resectable. And usually once you have involvement of more than 180-degree circumference or half circumference, that usually is a long area of involvement, and these areas you cannot do the resection. So here, this is basically a local reason why you cannot do the resection, and these are of course distant reasons. That means the tumor has gone into the distant areas and there's distant metastasis, therefore you cannot do resection. Now, tissue diagnosis, is it really important when you do a pancreatic malignancy surgery? Number one thing we need to know is, when you do the investigation, you will know after investigation whether the tumor is resectable or not resectable. If you find that the tumor is resectable, to proceed for surgery, usually a prior biopsy is not required. Because once you do the surgery, you will be able to take the tissues and send it for, histopathology. But here the key thing is, this kind of things can be done in those centers where routinely they are doing pancreatic surgeries, because the mortality and morbidity of pancreatic surgeries tend to be quite high. So in good centers, usually the resectable disease biopsy is not required. We proceed directly with the surgery, and after doing the surgery, the biopsy tissue is available. And therefore, we understand, high-grade malignancy, low-grade malignancy, and other features that information we get. Whereas, if the tumor is deemed as unresectable disease, in that case, surgery cannot be done. So in this patient, some form of chemotherapy or radiotherapy or combination of both may be given. But you don't start a patient on chemotherapy or radiotherapy unless you really know that this is a malignancy that I'm dealing with. So here, tissue diagnosis has to be obtained before we start any form of palliative chemotherapy or radiotherapy. So when biopsy is required, the best way to do the biopsy is if you can do a transduodenal or a transgastric FNA, either fine needle aspiration or a true cut biopsy performed, usually under endo ultrasound guidance. Okay, if you can do it under endo ultrasound guidance, that is the best way, because there is no dissemination of the tumor outside, that means into the general peritoneal cavity. Okay, whereas the periampullary carcinoma and especially ampullary carcinoma is a little different. If you have done an upper GI endoscopy and you find that there is some tumor tissue that is seen in that area, or if you have done a CT scan and the CT scan clearly tells you that this malignancy is on the lower end of CPD, in that case, at ERCP, maybe a brush can be put into the lower end of CPD and a brush cytology is taken. Whereas if the growth is already kind of visible into the lumen of the duodenum, in this case, under upper GI endoscopy, we can do a biopsy. Okay, so these are the various aspects about taking a tissue diagnosis. So take home message here, resectable disease, no need to do a biopsy. Unresectable disease, you have to have a diagnosis before you start palliative therapy. The best way of doing the biopsy is either transduodenal or transgastric at endo ultrasound guidance. Whereas in the case of periampullary carcinoma, at upper GI endoscopy or at ERCP, brush cytology can be taken. Now, surgical management. Classical surgery that is done for carcinoma head or pancreas or the ampullary carcinoma is usually what is called as in the West, it is the pylorus preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy. Pylorus preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy. Whereas in countries like ours, where this disease is not very common and when we don't do the surgery that often, we do what is called as the classical Whipple's or classical pancreaticoduodenectomy. Okay. How the classical pancreaticoduodenectomy is different from pylorus preserving pancreaticoduodenectomy is, in the case of Whipple's or the classical pancreaticoduodenectomy, when on the stomach end, what we do is we remove the distal about 40% of the stomach, in which the pylorus and also the antrum is removed. Whereas in the case of pylorus preserving, as the name goes, the pylorus is not actually taken out. Right from the D1 area, distal to the D1, the duodenum is taken out, including about the proximal 10 centimeters of the jejunum. Whereas in this case, right from the proximal 10 centimeters, the DJ flexure, the D4, D3, D2, D1, pylorus, and antrum, these are taken out. So the amount of stomach that is taken out is much more here, whereas the amount of stomach taken out is much less here. The reason why this new surgery came was when we used to take out the antrum and the pylorus. The pylorus is the area where the mechanism for sort of controlled emptying of the stomach is there. So what used to happen is we used to have a condition which is called as a dumping syndrome. That means basically soon after eating food, high osmolar food. That means food which has high osmolarity that suddenly comes into the small bowel, and that used to cause what is called as a dumping syndrome. By preserving the pylorus, we are avoiding this dumping syndrome. But now we find that instead of having a controlled emptying, there is actually holdup that happens. So that is called as a gastric delay. So gastric delay is a problem here, whereas in this case, dumping used to be a problem. So nowadays, pylorus preserving, there are many people who do not kind of prefer it. And I think for you at the MBBS level, I think the operation that you said, what is the operation for head or ampullary carcinoma? Your answer should be the classical Whipple's surgery, which is pancreatic urothectomy. Is there anything else you can do? Yes. What you can do is you can do a pylorus preserving. In pylorus preserving, you do what I have just said, and the advantage is it does not have the so-called dumping, but the disadvantage is it can lead to delayed gastric emptying. The oncological clearance when you do a classical Whipple's is much better as compared to a pylorus preserving pancreatic urothectomy. So many patients actually, many surgeons actually prefer to do the classical Whipple's when they are doing malignancies, whereas they may do a pylorus preserving when they are doing benign conditions. Whereas the body and the tail area, if you have the malignancy, you don't need to do the classical Whipple's, but what you can do is pancreatectomy. Usually in malignancy, you always take out the spleen. In non-malignant conditions, you try to preserve the spleen, and that is called as distal pancreatectomy without splenectomy. Whereas in cancers, you do a distal pancreatectomy along with splenectomy. And infiltration of the splenic artery or vein is never a problem because in any case, you're going to take out the spleen. So this is just a picture to show you. This is the classical pylorus preserving pancreatic urothectomy. Here, this line of transaction is at the level of the pylorus. So that means the proximal part, the pylorus, and the distal part, the D1. That is the area where you cut. Okay, and this is the head area, which has been taken out in the region of the neck. So we divide the pancreas just around the neck area, and we leave the body and the tail behind. Then, of course, these are the vessels which have been taken out from the superior mesenteric vessels. And here, the jejunum, this is the DJ flexure. And from the DJ flexure, about 10 centimeters, the jejunum is also taken out. So when you reconstruct, what you do is, the first thing that you reconstruct is you do this anastomosis, which is called as a pancreatic jejunostomy. The anastomosis between the remnant pancreas and the jejunum, that is called a pancreatic jejunostomy. Then after that, the next anastomosis that you do is to the same loop of jejunum, you anastomose the bile duct, that is called a choledochal jejunostomy. And then much lower down here, this part of jejunum is anastomosed to the stomach. That means the pylorus. So classically, it's not gastrojejunostomy, but it's almost like a pylorojejunostomy. That anastomosis. So these are the classical things that you will be doing in a case of pylorus preserving. Whereas in the case of these two anastomoses is the same in the classical Whipple's, but here instead of anastomosis of the pylorus, probably will be anastomosing to the body or the stomach because this part of the stomach is also taken out. So that is called as a classical gastrojejunostomy. That is how it is different. So in the next class, I'll be talking a little bit about palliative management of advanced lesions. So for today, I think we will end my class here. Next class, I will just talk a little bit about this particular operation because this is one of the most morbid operations that has ever been done in any malignancy. And there are a lot of technical aspects which are very important, and I think you should have some fair idea about them because this is a very important malignancy. Thank you.